A single box of matches holds a secret no one expected. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. Drop a comment and share where you're listening from. Your voices bring this journey alive. Let's begin. The stove in the Quai des Orfèvres apartment gave off a steady, muted warmth, the kind that seemed to press against the windows rather than spread evenly through the room. Maigret sat at the table with his morning pipe, the bowl resting comfortably in the curve of his hand, while Madame Maigret moved about with her quiet efficiency, arranging breakfast without comment. It was a grey morning, one of those Paris mornings when the drizzle was fine enough to blur the outlines of the buildings across the Seine. The sound of it was more felt than heard, as if the city itself exhaled. Maigret wasn't thinking of any particular case. He rarely did in these moments before leaving the apartment. He thought instead of the day's rhythm, of how the coffee tasted a little bitter without sugar, of the way Madame Maigret folded the napkins so neatly that he was reluctant to disturb them. It was the sort of domestic peace that always left him faintly surprised, though he would never say so aloud. He smoked slowly, letting the tobacco settle him, his broad shoulders relaxed inside his worn overcoat. When the telephone rang, it wasn't urgent, not exactly. A constable's voice, slightly nervous, informed him that a man had been found dead in a modest boarding house off Rue de Turenne. Nothing dramatic. A fall, perhaps, or a sudden illness. Still, the boarding house proprietress had insisted something was wrong. She had called with that peculiar mixture of alarm and defensiveness common to such people, eager for the police to come yet wary of their presence. Maigret listened, his eyes half closed, letting the words flow without interruption. Only when the constable faltered did he grunt an acknowledgement and replace the receiver. He stood, adjusted his hat, and slipped into his heavy coat. Madame Maigret looked up briefly from the stove, her eyes questioning without words. He gave her a small nod, almost apologetic, and left the apartment. On the landing, the air was cooler, tinged with the dampness from the rain seeping in through cracks in the old walls. By the time he stepped outside, the drizzle clung to his hat brim, dripping slowly onto his collar. The cab ride was unremarkable. He watched the streets pass in a blur of umbrellas, shop awnings sagging under droplets, bicycles leaned against lamp-posts. The driver complained idly about traffic near the market. Maigret nodded, pipe unlit now, his gaze unfocused. He wasn't hurrying. He rarely did. Cases, like people, revealed themselves at their own pace. The Rue de Turenne boarding house was nondescript, with peeling paint on the shutters and a faint smell of cabbage that clung to the narrow hall. A woman in a worn apron met him at the door, wringing her hands on the cloth. She led him up a flight of creaking stairs, speaking quickly about her lodgers, about how quiet they usually were, about how she had noticed something unusual that morning. Maigret let her talk, his heavy steps sounding measured on the wooden stairs. He asked no questions yet. Questions too soon only frightened people into silence. At the top, she opened a door. The room inside was small, tidy in the way of lodgers who own little. On the table, beside an ashtray filled with short butts, lay a half-empty box of matches. It was this detail Maigret's eyes lingered on, though he said nothing. The man on the bed seemed ordinary. Shirt sleeves, face slack, no sign of violence. It might have been the heart, or the lungs, or some tired organ finally giving up. But Maigret's instinct, never something he could quite explain, told him the matchbox mattered, or at least that the room was not as ordinary as it wished to appear. He stood by the window, looking down at the wet cobblestones below. A woman crossed the street with a basket under her arm. Somewhere a church bell chimed. Maigret filled his pipe but did not light it. Behind him, the proprietress was still talking, her words tripping over themselves, her tone both defensive and fearful. He let her. Words filled silence, and in silence, truth sometimes hid. The drizzle thickened against the glass. Maigret turned at last, his broad figure filling the small space. He bent slightly, studying the matchbox again, then straightened. He didn't know yet what it meant, if it meant anything at all, but he felt the faint, familiar stirring. A case not pressing, not urgent, but one that would not leave him alone. A man dead in a small room, a box of matches out of place, and the uneasy chatter of a landlady who perhaps knew more than she wanted to. He exhaled softly, almost a sigh. The day, it seemed, had decided its course for him. He did not move for a while. In these rooms there was always a first quiet in which the dead man took up all the space. The proprietress had fallen silent at last, breathing a little faster than she wished him to notice, her hands still busy twisting the corner of the apron as if it were a damp cloth she meant to wring. The constable kept to the threshold, cap in his hands, eyes flicking from the bed to Maigret and back again as if waiting for something decisive to be said. Nothing decisive was said. Maigret crossed to the table and stood over it, the way a man in a cafe stands over an unfinished bill. The ashtray was heavy, the thick glass kind with a chipped lip. The butts were short, pressed down hard as though a thrifty man had smoked them to the last possible breath. A few were Gauloises, recognizable by their darker paper. Others were long, pale, the tobacco inside shredded finer. Two people's habits lived together in that small heap unless the dead man had two tastes, and people almost never had two genuine tastes. He picked up the ashtray, felt the sticky tar on the underside with his thumb and set it down again. He did not touch the matchbox, half empty, its cover printed with a small advertisement in blue ink. Buvette des Sports, Charenton, Vins au Vert. The lid was smudged by fingertips but not worn. The striker's sanded strip had been scraped only a little, in a single corner. He inclined his head the way he did when listening to a stubborn witness who believed he had already told everything. Charenton was not far, and yet for certain kinds of lodgers even Charenton was a world away. "Madame?" he said without turning. "Besson," she supplied at once. She had expected to be asked. "Clémence Besson. The house is my husband's, but he is with his sister this week. He has rheumatism in the left knee in this weather. And the lodger, Monsieur." He signed as Monsieur Bernard. That is what he wrote in the book. "I don't inquire, you understand, unless it concerns quiet and regular payments. He paid each Saturday for the week in cash. No trouble. I cannot say anything against him. God rest him." He glanced over his shoulder. "How long?" "A little under 2 months. Since the last week of March. He took the room when Mademoiselle Lise went to live with her cousin. You may ask anyone, Monsieur le Commissaire. He was no trouble." He let the title pass. On mornings like this, the uniform men called him Commissaire, automatically, even if he had not made it an official matter. He drew back the curtain with 2 fingers. The grey light admitted itself reluctantly, bringing with it the smell of wet stone and street. The glass was damp on the inside, kempt with the small trace of sleeve leaves when someone wipes without thinking. The window latch had a flap of rust under the screw, an old house's fatigue. On the sill, a line of dust had been smudged clean in the middle. He turned and considered the man on the bed. Face slack, mouth slightly open, the way of a man who had fallen asleep reading the ceiling. The shirt was not fresh, but not filthy. His collar lay folded like a white question mark on the chair. His feet were bare, the toes slightly curled as if at a draught. On the narrow mat by the bed, the impression of his soles was visible where the damp on his skin had darkened it. Under the bed, neatly aligned, a pair of shoes that had been polished recently, too recently for a lodger who had smoked his cigarettes to the end to save a few centimes. They were polished with care, the way a man does on a day he expects to be seen. "Who found him?" Maigret asked. "I did," said Madame Besson quickly. "I knocked. He did not answer. It was past the time he should have gone out, because on Tuesdays he always left before 8. I opened. I have a key. It is necessary for cleaning. And I saw him. At first I thought perhaps he had had too much to drink, but it was not that. There was no smell. He was cold already, monsieur. The constable shifted his weight. The doctor is on his way, he offered, as if promising help for an ailment Maigret did not have. Good. He went to the washstand. The enamel basin held a little water with a scum of soap where the last rinse had not been tipped. A sliver lay in the dish, worn to an oval thin enough to see light through. The toothbrush's bristles flared on one side, the habit of a left-handed man, perhaps. But then, some people were untidy, and some were simply heavy on their hands. The towel was dry. He touched it. The loop was still twisted as it had dried after use. He smelled the air. Shaving water lingered faintly, and something else. A faint medicinal scent. Camphor or eucalyptus. It did not come from the washstand. Madame Besson had edged a little nearer, drawn by his silence. He coughed, she said. He had a cough. The walls are paper, monsieur. One hears everything, not always what one would wish to hear. I sleep on the second floor behind the kitchen. At night sometimes I heard his cough through the pipe, and footsteps very late, once or twice, the kind that try not to make a sound. When? She blinked. Pardon? The late footsteps. She considered, anxious to be exact and afraid to be wrong. A fortnight ago, and perhaps last Thursday. It may have been someone else. People come and go. But this house, it is quiet. I know my boarders. You saw anyone with him? Her mouth tightened. We don't have that sort of thing. I don't allow it. One must keep respectability. If there had been a woman. He waited. If there had been a woman, she said finally, I would have known. But a man might come with a parcel, say, or to ask for a light, I cannot say. He didn't like to be looked at. He paid, he kept to himself. He never left washing for me. He did it himself here. He nodded in the direction of the shoes. And the Polish. She hesitated, then lifted her chin. He borrowed a rag and a drop of oil from me on Sunday evening. He returned the rag. It was quite black. A rattle from the stairs announced the doctor, a thin man with a damp beard, who set his bag down on the chair with the folded collar and scolded the constable under his breath for the state of the stair carpet. They exchanged nods. The examination began in the unobtrusive way of such rooms. A cool hand on a forehead, fingers pressing the wrists, an ear bent to a chest that had nothing more to say. The doctor frowned, pursed his lips, said something about the heart, about a failure that could come in the night without warning. Any marks? Maigret asked. None I can see. No bruise, no petechiae that force themselves on the eye. The man was precise, a school teacher of bodies. No smell of spirits. The fingers are stained. He smoked much. He tilted the chin. There is a dryness to the tongue. He was parched. It might be the cough you spoke of. He nodded toward Madame. Besson, or simply nerves. The time, I would say early morning, perhaps before dawn. He is cold, but not stiff as stone. You know how it is. He closed his bag with a click, as if folding an opinion inside. Thank you, said Maigret. He did not smile, while the doctor made the necessary remarks to the constable about formalities. Maigret sat down on the chair facing the table. He took out his pipe and turned it in his hands. He did not light it. He watched the matchbox without looking at it directly. A thing can tell you more if it thinks you have forgotten it exists. What did he do? He asked, almost to himself. Madame Besson was grateful to have something she could answer. A clerk. He said so. In the mornings he left with a briefcase. He returned around 7. He ate upstairs in his room. I heard his cutlery. He kept to himself, I told you. He never sent for a newspaper. He read nothing. No, he had a small book, very worn, but it was not a... No, it was a notebook, I think, with dates. He wrote little things. He sat by the window sometimes, writing and looking. Where is the briefcase? Her face altered. Not alarm, not quite. Something like annoyance with herself, because she had not noticed until now the absence. "It is not here," she said. The constable, sensing a task, lifted the single chair, peered behind the washstand, crouched to look under the bed. Nothing. Maigret did not join him. He knew how absence looked. A man had left at some hour with a briefcase, or someone had taken it. The result was the same, a quiet rectangle of space where a thing had been. On the table, a round ring of moisture showed where a glass had stood recently. He touched it with the back of his knuckle. It was cold, but the moisture still held its edge. He looked at the water jug. The level was near the top. A careful man would not have spilled. A nervous man would. He reached then and laid a thick finger on the side of the matchbox. He slid the inner tray a few millimeters. It moved reluctantly, as if the cardboard was swollen by damp. Or something else impeded it. He did not force it. He pushed it back. The room breathed. He could hear from the street below a barrowman calling his route, voice flattened by the rain. Somewhere a door closed, and footsteps crossed the landing. Life went on in the house, making the dead man's stillness more eloquent. "Who lives next door?" he asked. "Mademoiselle Lise's old room is empty." The proprietress ticked her fingers in the air, counting. On the other side, Monsieur Vernier, a bookkeeper at the wine merchant's. Above us, a workman from the foundry in Ivry. He goes out before sunrise. And Mademoiselle Rose, who sews, but she is with her sister today on the Rue Amelot because the wedding season is upon us, and the hems must be turned quickly. On the top floor, 2 students who are not often present. They pay late, but they pay. "Ask Monsieur Vernier to come in." While she went, he allowed himself to lean backward, the chair creaking under his weight. The dead man had kept his collar off, perhaps because of the cough. The ashtray with its 2 sorts of butts. The matchbox from Charenton. The polished shoes. A clerk who wrote in a notebook and kept to himself, or a man who wished to be taken for a clerk. Paris was full of both, moving through the wet mornings with briefcases that were always more and sometimes less than they seemed. Monsieur Vernier arrived with a careful little bow and a smell of damp wool. He was one of those narrow men whose elbows seem to apologize for existing. His round spectacles had misted at the edges. "I don't wish to," he began, and then saw the bed. "Ah, yes, I thought as much." He seemed disappointed, as if something had ended before a conversation had begun. "You knew him?" Maigret asked. "We greeted each other on the landing. I'm employed at Chevalier and Fils, the wine merchant on Rue Saint-Antoine. He, Monsieur Bernard, never said where he worked. I thought perhaps on the boulevard, in one of those insurance offices where they stamp things." He looked at his shoes, then up again. He coughed, a dry cough. Sometimes at night I heard another man's lighter click and then the cough would pause. I assumed a friend. We all have friends. "The other man's lighter?" Maigret repeated mildly. Vernier colored faintly. "You can hear a match from here." He gestured, embarrassed by his attention to small noises. Monsieur Bernard's matches made a small, rough sound like sand. The other was sharper, a metal wheel. "Forgive me. I did not mean to. It is a silly distinction." "It is not silly." And sometimes, after the second light, the cigarette smell was different. Perhaps I am talking nonsense. "No." Maigret's gaze drifted to the ashtray. "You smell wine for a living." Vernier gave a quick, grateful smile that vanished at once. He folded his hands. 2 weeks ago, a man came late and did not greet me. He went straight up, and his shoes were quiet on the stairs, as if he did not wish to be heard. "Did you see his face?" "Only his back. He was not tall. He wore a hat like a butcher's boy, no brim, and his coat was too fine for such a hat." He hesitated. "Last Thursday also, later. That time there was a woman at the door below. She spoke softly. I cannot say if she came in. It was raining very hard." "What time does the workman above leave?" always before 5. I hear him. He does not try to be quiet. He is a good man. He sings sometimes. This morning I heard him at the usual time. I did not hear Monsieur Bernard move after that. Thank you. When the bookkeeper had gone, shutting the door with care as if afraid to disturb something that was already finished, Maigret looked once more round the room. It was tidy, yes, but the tidiness of someone who tidies for others to see. A towel turned, with its loop straight, shoes set even, collar folded, a polished line on the floor where the briefcase had lived, a matchbox from Charenton that slid reluctantly under a thick finger. Outside, the rain altered slightly, becoming heavier for a passage, then returning to its even fall. The way talk in a cafe rises and calms again. He rose. "We'll wait," he said to the constable, softly enough that it might have been said only to the air. He would stay in the house a little. Sit in the kitchen perhaps and accept coffee if it was offered, and let the rooms tell him what they could. Someone would come, because someone always did. A man who returned for a thing he had left, a woman who had not planned to be there and would now avoid being seen, or simply the hush of neighbors whose glances gave themselves away at the landing. He had time. He always had time. It was other people who ran out of it. On the table, the ring of moisture had begun to blur at the edge. He looked at it once more, then reached past it without hurry and drew the matchbox toward him with 2 fingers. He did not open it. He only weighed it in his palm, as one weighs a small fruit to guess at the sweetness, and felt that it was ever so slightly heavier than it should have been. Then he set it down again, exact in its place, and followed Madame Besson into the narrow corridor that smelled of cabbage and wet wool, to sit a while and listen. The kitchen was warm in a way that felt improvised rather than planned. A single stove gave out its heat unevenly, the smell of boiled cabbage still clinging in the air, as if the walls themselves remembered the last meal cooked. Madame Besson busied herself with the ritual of coffee, clattering the tin pot against the enamel sink, spooning grounds with an energy that betrayed her agitation. She spoke too quickly and too much, her words chasing after one another in an effort to fill the silence that seemed to settle wherever Maigret sat. He said nothing, only nodded occasionally and allowed the smoke from his pipe to wind up into the low ceiling beams. He liked kitchens such as this, where a life showed itself without any effort to disguise. The cracked saucer at the back of the shelf, the row of glass jars that no longer matched their lids, the faded calendar pinned beside the door, they were as telling as any testimony. Madame Besson placed the coffee on the table with a little flourish, as if it might distract him from asking more. Her husband's absence, the rheumatic knee, the missing lodger's briefcase, it all hovered unspoken between them. She lowered herself into the chair opposite, folding her apron across her lap. "You see, Monsieur le Commissaire, I never had trouble in this house. People pay, they live quietly. I say nothing. Only once in a while someone drinks too much or quarrels. But never Monsieur Bernard. He was polite. Reserved, yes, but respectful." Maigret lifted the small cup, tasted, and let her words run. The liquid was bitter, thin, but it warmed him. He puffed once on his pipe, the ember glowing faintly, and asked, "He received letters?" The proprietress hesitated. "Yes, a few, not many, 1 or 2 each week, always in the afternoon delivery. I left them on the hall table. He picked them up without comment. Small envelopes, white. Ordinary. You recall any handwriting?" Her eyes narrowed, trying to remember. Neat. A woman's hand, I think. Round, careful letters. But one envelope was typed. A fortnight ago, perhaps. I noticed because it was thicker, and he slipped it quickly into his pocket when he returned. Did he answer letters? I never saw him post anything. Perhaps he did elsewhere. There is a box at the corner. She folded her arms as though she had given him all that was proper. The door to the kitchen opened, and Vernier, the bookkeeper, poked his head inside. He looked apologetic, adjusting his spectacles with a hand that trembled slightly. "Monsieur, forgive me, but I thought you should know. Just now on the landing I heard a step. A woman." She came halfway up, then stopped. I opened my door and she had already turned back down, a scarf over her hair. I could not see her face. Maigret rose without hurry, placing the cup neatly on its saucer. He stepped into the dim hall, the smell of cabbage replaced by the raw dampness of the stairwell. It was empty. From below came only the faint creak of the front door closing, followed by the patter of footsteps on wet stone. He leaned over the banister but saw nothing, only a blur of rain on the panes by the door. He did not pursue. He returned to the kitchen where Vernier lingered uneasily. "It is nothing, perhaps," the man stammered. "Only the way she stopped, as if she meant to come higher and then thought better of it." Maigret looked at him steadily, then nodded once. "You did well to tell me." The bookkeeper flushed, relieved, and withdrew again, leaving behind the faint odor of damp wool. The commissaire sat down heavily, pipe between his teeth, and allowed silence to reassert itself. A woman who hesitated on the stairs, a briefcase gone, cigarettes smoked by 2 hands, a matchbox that weighed more than it should. The details did not yet connect, but they had the texture of a life trying to hide itself in the crevices of another. The coffee cooled. Rain hissed against the shutters. He imagined the dead man lying as they had left him, shirt open at the throat, toes curled as though resisting the inevitable. A man who coughed, who polished his shoes carefully before Sunday evening, who received neat, round letters from a woman and once a thicker envelope by machine. None of it had the violence of crime, but it smelled wrong, the way soup smells wrong when cabbage has been boiled too long in the same pot. After a time, he rose and asked Madame Besson to bring him the register. She fetched it from the cupboard where she kept it, under folded linen. The book was old, its pages lined with the cramped signatures of years of transience. Some scrawled, some bold, most written with hesitation, as if each lodger had paused to decide what name would serve him best in that house. He flipped through until March. Bernard was written in a careful, deliberate hand. Not clerks, not hurried. Too neat, almost as if the man had practiced it. Beneath, the address column stood blank. Occupation. Employé. The page offered no more. He closed the book with a soft thud and handed it back. "Do you mind?" he said mildly. "If I wait here a while?" She blinked at him, then shrugged. "As you wish. You will take more coffee?" "Later." And so he waited. Hours were one of his tools, as precise as the magnifying glass or revolver of another man. He filled his pipe again, struck a match, and smoked slowly, watching the flame curl upward before dying. Through the walls, he heard ordinary life. The shuffle of the workman returning for his midday rest, the click of Vernier's typewriter keys in his room, the footsteps of Mademoiselle Rose coming back from her sister's sewing shop. When she entered the kitchen to prepare her own meal, she found Maigret sitting there as if he had always belonged. She was a pale young woman, scarcely more than 20, her hair pulled back hastily, her eyes dark from long hours at the needle. She startled when she saw him, then composed herself. "Mademoiselle Rose," he said gently. "Yes, monsieur." "You knew Monsieur Bernard?" She shrugged. "We said bonsoir, that is all." She busied herself with the bread knife, slicing carefully. "He received visitors?" Her hands paused a fraction too long on the loaf. "Sometimes. Not often. Once or twice. I never saw their faces. A man once, and perhaps a woman, but I was not watching." "Yet you remember." She glanced at him, caught his steady gaze, and lowered her eyes. "One listens, even when one does not wish to. His cough, one could hear it. And one could hear when he did not cough, when he was not alone." She flushed. "I mind my own affairs, monsieur." "I know." He puffed on his pipe. "What sort of man was he?" She hesitated. Quiet, polite. He walked as if he did not want to disturb the floorboards, but sometimes at night I heard him pacing, back and forth slowly, like someone reciting lessons. Lessons? Yes. The floor creaked in the same rhythm again and again, then silence, then again. Maigret nodded, letting her words fall into place among the others. A man rehearsing, perhaps, what he would say, or what he would never dare to say. She excused herself with the bread and withdrew. The kitchen was silent once more. The rain had softened outside, turning to mist. He tamped his pipe, listening to the house breathe around him. He had the sense of threads crossing, letters, a woman on the stairs, shoes polished, coughs stifled. They did not yet weave into a pattern, but he had learned to wait. Late in the afternoon, the constable returned from the prefecture with papers for the official report. He looked uncomfortable to find the commissaire still there, sitting in the same chair, the same pipe now cold between his teeth. "Shall I remove the body, monsieur?" "Not yet. Leave him tonight." The young man frowned, but did not argue. Maigret's quiet authority had a way of pressing questions back down before they were spoken. The constable left again, his boots squeaking on the wet floorboards. Night fell gradually, the house dimming as lamps were lit one by one. Shadows stretched long across the landing. Maigret remained. At 9, he heard Vernier's careful tread as he returned from his office. At 10, the workmen upstairs sang a few lines before sleep. The house settled, and then, close to 11, a knock sounded at the front door. Light, hesitant, as if the caller wished to be admitted without being noticed. Maigret did not rise immediately. He listened. The pause, then a second knock, slightly firmer. At last, Madame Besson shuffled down the hall in her slippers and opened. A man's voice murmured, low and urgent. She answered quickly, nervously. Maigret stepped out of the kitchen, his broad frame filling the hallway, his pipe hanging from his hand. The man at the door started slightly. He wore a dark coat, rain-damp, and held his hat low over his eyes. In his other hand he carried something wrapped in brown paper, flat and rectangular. "Good evening," Maigret said, his tone mild but unyielding. The man blinked, as if uncertain whether to flee or invent a reason for his presence. The parcel trembled slightly in his grasp. It was not what he said that interested Maigret in that moment, nor even what he carried. It was the way his fingers clutched the paper too tightly, the way his shoulders hunched as though under a weight greater than the rain. And it was the faint, acrid scent that reached Maigret's nose even from across the hall. Tobacco, but not the kind the dead man smoked. Maigret did not move, only watched and waited for the silence to do its work. The man at the door seemed to come apart without moving. The hat stayed low, the parcel stayed tucked against his ribs, but something in his shoulders slackened, as if a thread had been cut inside him. He took in Maigret's bulk in the hallway, the pipe turned in that slow way between thick fingers, the proprietress hovering with her apron smoothed flat like a shield. He did not ask who Maigret was. He asked, very quietly, "Is he here?" "In his room," Maigret said. "He won't be coming down." The man's eyes flicked to the stairs and back. He swallowed. The rain ticked on the panes. The smell that had caught Maigret a moment before, the unfamiliar tobacco, a little sharp, a little foreign, seemed to arrive with the parcel each time the man breathed. "You had business," Maigret said, letting the words fall like a coat on a chair. "Come into the kitchen. It's warmer there." In the kitchen, the stove's uneven warmth pressed against the damp of the hallway. The man set the parcel down on the table's bare boards as if it might run if he let it. He kept a hand on it. He was not tall. The wet had glued a strand of hair to his forehead. He had a clean collar, but the button of his cuff was cracked and pinched his wrist. Small economies showed in small places. Madame Besson made the movement of offering coffee, then stopped when she saw how the man's throat worked as he looked at the chair and chose to remain standing. Maigret did not sit either. He leaned a hip against the table, pipe cool between his fingers. "What's your name?" he asked, and the man hesitated the fraction that told Maigret he was choosing one. "Morel," he said then. "Louis." "Morel," Maigret repeated, without any shade of belief or disbelief, the way he might repeat the name of a wine someone had recommended. "You came late." "He asked me to. After 10, the house would be quiet," he said. The voice was low, the vowels flat, the habit of a man used to speaking in rooms where doors had ears. "You're a friend?" "Acquaintance," he said quickly. "We knew each other from Charenton." The word slipped out and he made a small grimace because it had not been the right word to let out first. "From the quay," he added. "We played cards sometimes. He lifted a hand as if to push the sentence back into his mouth. "I brought him some papers." "And now?" Maigret asked softly. The man's hand tightened on the parcel. He took out a cigarette, long and pale, and a metal lighter flashed and clicked, the sound neat as a punctuation mark. He drew in smoke too fast, coughed once, not the dry rack that had belonged to the dead man, but the cough of someone whose nerves had decided to misfire. The smoke's smell was the same as the thin notes that had lingered in the ashtray upstairs. "You can leave it," Maigret said, and only then did he glance at the parcel. If it was meant for him. "It's nothing," the man said, quick again. "Copies. He said he needed them rewritten clean, without the corrections." His eyes flickered toward Madame Besson as if the word corrections might carry a charge. "You typed them?" "Yes. You know him as Bernard?" The pause this time was not indecision, but a calculation. "He told me that was his name." "And you didn't believe him?" The man shrugged with one shoulder, a movement he may have thought might pass for a joke. "It did not." "What does it matter?" he said. "Now." The last word was both excuse and plea. "You were here last Thursday," Maigret remarked, as if they had been speaking about the weather. "Late." The cigarette trembled, an almost invisible ripple at its lit end. He wasn't expecting me." His eyes slid away. "The rain. I stopped at the door. I didn't go up. And earlier, a fortnight ago." Silence lengthened by a heartbeat. "I went up then," he said at last. "There was a letter he wanted me to take. Typed. He had told me what to put." "And you took it to the post?" "I posted it," he said. "Near the bridge." Another quick drag, another cough that was half swallowed. He had not yet asked, in any direct way, what had happened upstairs. He looked as if he didn't want the answer to exist at all. "What did you put in the letter?" Maigret asked. He said it without pressure. He simply left the question in the air like the steam from a coffee cup. "I don't read other people's letters," the man said. Too fast, then slower. "I don't read them if they are not for me." The second half was a compromise with the truth. He was a man who worked around papers, a messenger, a copyist, an evening typist in a small printing shop off the Rue de Charenton, perhaps. His jacket smelled faintly of ink and catch paper. On his right thumb, the edge of the nail was blackened in a way that no tobacco could produce. "You said Charenton," Maigret remarked, as if he had only just thought of it. "He went there." "We all go there," the man said, almost angry with the generality. "Sundays. There is a buvette by the bridge where you can sit a long time over one glass." He saw the mistake a second later and grimaced again. "Everyone has their places," he added weakly. "Buvette des Sports," Maigret said. It was not a question. The man's eyes went still for a moment, and that was enough. "Matches," he said then, with a kind of small, defeated flourish. "They give them out. He always had them. The man stopped because he had arrived at the edge of a fact he did not wish to put into the room. "You came tonight to bring him papers," Maigret said. "He is dead. You can leave them." "I would rather..." The man cut himself off. He looked at the parcel, then at the door, then at Maigret. What he would rather do was go, quickly, with everything he had brought, and take with him whatever problem the dead man had been. He saw in Maigret's face that he would not be allowed. "You'll leave them," Maigret repeated, not unkindly, in the tone of someone asking a child to put down a knife. Morel, if that was his name, nodded. He placed the parcel flat, as if it were an animal that might buck, and drew his hand away at last. His fingers left small, damp prints on the brown paper. "You worked on these in the evenings," Maigret said. "In a shop." "I have a machine," the man said quickly. "At home. It is easier that way. I have a wife who sleeps light." He gave a small, unhappy smile that had no mirth in it. "When the keys go too fast, she tells me I'm dreaming loudly." "You have a good lighter," Maigret said, and the man looked, puzzled and then wary, as if compliment and question could be the same instrument. "It was a present," he said, "from someone who was grateful." "You came alone?" The man's face rearranged itself into blankness with an effort that made the effort visible. "Of course." "There was a woman on the stairs earlier," Maigret said. "She changed her mind." His eyes flicked to the door again, then to Madame Besson, then back. He said nothing. "Go home," Maigret told him. "If anyone asks, you did not see him today. If you think of anything you have not told me about Charenton, about letters, come tomorrow morning to the Quai des Orfèvres." He turned the pipe in his palm, studying the dead ash as if it were a weather map. "And if you do not think of anything, come all the same." The man looked astonished for a second, as though he had expected to be held. The relief made him clumsy. His hat nearly fell as he pulled it down. He nodded too many times. "Yes, monsieur," he said. He almost put out his hand, and then thought better of it. He left with a quickness that was not quite a flight, the smell of his cigarette still standing for him in the kitchen after the door had closed. Madame Besson exhaled, realizing she had held her breath. "People come late," she said, as if defending herself against an imagined accusation. "They say it is better not to disturb at hours when other tenants are present. One tries to be accommodating." Maigret did not answer. He carried the parcel upstairs, his tread slow. In the room, the doctor's absence had left a particular quiet, the kind that follows a voice that has stopped speaking in a language one did not quite understand. The dead man lay as before. The window had filmed again with moisture, and a droplet at the low edge had fattened until it held a tiny, upside-down Paris in its rounded belly. On the table, he set the parcel beside the ashtray and the matchbox. He untied the string without tearing the knot, unwound the paper, and found inside what he had expected: a thin file of onion skin sheets with carbon smudges, a stiffer paper with figures typed in neat columns, a small notebook with a blue cover worn smooth by thumb and pocket. The numbers meant nothing by themselves. A date at the top of one page matched last Thursday. A stamped letterhead appeared on another: Chevalier and Fils, the wine merchant on Rue Saint-Antoine, the same where Vernier was employed. The pages were not stolen from the wine merchant. They were imitations. The typewriter had done its best to be exact, and had failed at the second E, a fraction too pale. The attentive could see it. Why a clerk would need false copies of accounts that were almost, but not quite, the same as the real ones, was a question with too many soft answers. Accusation, defense, a calculation for a debt, a favor for a friend to frighten a third man. He did not choose among them yet. He opened the notebook. The entries were brief, dates, places abbreviated, a few initials. There were small sums, added and crossed out and added again. Twice there was char, with a number and a time. Once BS, and beneath it, dim. He turned a page and a scrap of paper fell, no larger than a postage stamp. A name, Rose, and below it a street he already knew. He put the scrap back between the leaves and closed the cover. His eye went again to the matchbox. He stood looking at it for a little while without touching it, then slid his thumb along the tray a fraction. It checked at the same point as earlier, not with the resistance of swollen cardboard, but with the presence of something that did not belong. He moved to the window and held the box there in the weak light. With the nail of his little finger, he prized the tray gently, breathed out, and tipped the contents into his palm. Matches fell, the gray heads a small, soft rattle. With them came a thing that was not a match, a narrow key, brass darkened by finger and pocket, with a hole at the top through which a thread had been tied and cut away. On one side, stamped shallowly, was C17. The thread had left a faint blue stain where it had been knotted. The key was not to a door. It was too small, too thin. A locker, a box, a drawer at a left luggage near the bridge, perhaps, or at a buvette where certain men kept certain drawers. He set it on the table, and the small sound it made seemed to go a long way in the quiet room. He shook the matchbox to hear if it had anything else to say. Nothing. He put the matches back, leaving the key out, and closed the tray until it hid again in the advertisement in blue ink. Buvette des Sports, Charenton, vin au vert. The rain made a new path along the glass and crossed the old one, as if tracing a map with a second uncertain hand. The house moved around him in the way houses do at night when they are full of sleeping. A floorboard sighed. Someone coughed 2 rooms away. A cart went by below, wheels muffled. He lit his pipe at last, not with the dead man's matches, but with his own, and drew the smoke in slowly, as if the answer might be hiding somewhere in it. He let it out again and watched it wander toward the ceiling. In the morning, he would go to Charenton. He would sit at the Buvette des Sports over a glass that lasted longer than it should, and he would wait with the patience of a man who has made a life of waiting. Someone would recognize the shape his hat made against the rain. Someone would look twice at the key if he put it down near his right hand. Someone would say too quickly, "You must be mistaken. We don't keep drawers here." For the moment, he put the key in his pocket and the notebook with it. He left the papers as they were and closed the door behind him softly, so that the dead man did not feel the draught. On the landing, the lamp burned with a little fringe of soot at its edge. He stood there a moment, listening to the house tell him what it would before it fell completely silent. Then he went back down to the kitchen where the last of the coffee had tightened into a bitter skin in the pot, and sat with his pipe and the rain for company, letting the night pass at its own pace, which was his as well. The rain had given way by morning to a dull sky that seemed pressed low over the rooftops, the kind of Paris day when the air carried no freshness, only damp stone and soot. Maigret rose early, though he had hardly slept, and walked from the boarding-house with the same heavy gait as always, as though nothing about him had altered. But in his pocket the small brass key tapped against his pipe as he walked, reminding him of its presence with each step. The streets were washed in a watery light. A baker opened his shutters, flour already dusting his apron. A delivery cart rattled past, the horses' hooves slipping a little on the slick cobbles. Maigret found a cafe near the Bastille and sat by the window. He took his time over a bowl of coffee, letting the steam rise, watching the pedestrians hurry with collars turned up. The matchbox with its Charenton advertisement lay in his coat pocket, though he never took it out. He did not need to. The blue letters were clear enough in his mind. At 10 he caught a tram, its windows fogged from the damp coats pressed together inside, and let it carry him down toward Charenton. He sat in silence, ignoring the glances of a few clerks who wondered at the large man with the immovable face. The Seine came into view, brown and swollen from the days of rain, sliding past with a kind of tired determination. Charenton was quieter than Paris proper, a suburb that wore its work clothes even on a weekday morning. The buvette was easy to find. It stood near the bridge, modest, with a faded awning that sagged where water had collected, and its door half ajar to the smell of cheap wine and smoke. Inside, a few tables were already occupied, an old man with a newspaper, a pair of bargemen drinking early, and a woman with a scarf who stared too long into her glass. Maigret chose a table against the wall. He ordered a glass of red, dark and thin, and let it sit before him untouched. His pipe was unlit in his hand. He was in no hurry. The place was small, the kind of establishment where everyone looked up when the door opened, then looked down again quickly. A calendar hung behind the counter with a picture of a horse race. The barman was a thick-set fellow with a drooping mustache, his sleeves rolled high, his eyes pale and suspicious of strangers who lingered. When Maigret finally lit his pipe, the flare of the match seemed to draw more attention than it should have. The bargeman glanced over, then away. The woman with the scarf shifted uneasily, her chair scraping the floorboards. The barman wiped his hands on his apron, watching. It was not the commissaire himself who made them uneasy, but the quiet certainty with which he sat, filling the room without effort, his gaze moving slowly as if weighing the air. On the table he placed the brass key, casual, as if it had fallen from his pocket by mistake. He turned it once with his thick finger, then left it. The gesture was deliberate, but unspoken. A test, the way a fisherman lets his line drift until something pulls. The woman with the scarf looked at it first. Her eyes caught and then darted away too quickly. The barman, carrying a glass to another table, glanced down as he passed, and for a fraction of a second his step faltered. He set the glass down and returned behind the counter without a word. The bargemen did not notice. They were too busy arguing over some small bet. Maigret puffed slowly, watching smoke cloud before him. He had all day if needed. He knew how rooms revealed themselves in time, how silence could be a sharper instrument than any question. It was the woman who broke first. She stood suddenly, pulling her scarf tighter, and left coins on the table with a clatter too loud for the small bill. She slipped through the door, but in her haste she glanced back once at the key, and the fear in that glance was worth more than a confession. He let her go. It was not the time. He looked instead at the barman, who busied himself unnecessarily with wiping a dry counter. Maigret rose, carrying his glass, and set it on the bar. "You have drawers for customers?" he asked in his heavy, almost casual tone. The mustache twitched. "Drawers? For what?" "For keeping things safe. Papers. Keys." He set the brass key on the wood, turning it once so the stamped letters faced up. The barman's eyes flicked to it, then away. He poured another glass automatically, though Maigret had not asked. "We are not a bank," he said. "People keep their things at home." "Not everyone has a home," Maigret replied mildly. The silence stretched. The barman shifted, then leaned forward, lowering his voice. "C-17, is it? You'll find nothing. He hasn't come in 3 days." "Who?" The man shrugged, but it was the shrug of someone caught in the middle. "The one who took the key. A clerk, perhaps, or someone who wished to look like one. It is no affair of mine. He paid for the drawer. What men put in their drawers is their business." "And now?" The barman wiped his mustache with the back of his hand. "Now it is empty. He came last Friday. He collected what was his. That is all I know." Maigret did not argue. He slipped the key back into his pocket and nodded. "Thank you." He left without finishing the second glass. The air outside was damp, smelling of the river. He stood a moment on the bridge, watching the water drag itself beneath, thinking. The dead man had hidden something here, in a drawer in a buvette that gave out matchboxes as advertisements. He had removed it on Friday, hours before he was found lifeless in his bed. The briefcase gone, the papers typed, the notebooks with figures that matched too closely the accounts of Chevalier and Fils. It began to smell less of a heart failing in the night, and more of something prepared, something hurried. Back in Paris, he went not to the Quai des Orfèvres, but to Rue Saint-Antoine. Chevalier and Fils stood with its green-painted shutters and gold lettering half-faded. He entered without introduction, letting his size and silence announce him. Clerks at high desks looked up, startled. A thin man with a nervous mustache came forward, spectacles flashing. "May I?" "Vernier works here," Maigret said. The man blinked. Yes, of course. He is upstairs. May I?" "Take me." They climbed a narrow stair to a room with tall windows, ledgers stacked high, the smell of ink and dust. Vernier looked up from his desk, surprise flickering quickly into unease. He rose, adjusting his spectacles. "Commissaire!" Maigret raised a hand. "The papers," he said simply. "The ones you work with." The accounts. Vernier hesitated, then pulled a ledger toward him. The columns of figures marched down in neat rows, totals precise. Maigret placed one of the onion skin sheets from his pocket beside it. The similarity was close enough to fool a casual glance, but the paley was there, the tiny imperfection. Vernier paled. His fingers touched the page and drew back as if burned. "You see," Maigret said quietly, "your neighbor copied your work. He had a friend with a typewriter." "Why?" The bookkeeper stammered. I don't know. I swear I don't. I never—" He asked questions, yes, about my hours, about what kind of accounts we kept, but I thought he was lonely. He wanted to talk? I never imagined— He broke off, flustered. "You never wondered why a clerk needed copies of figures he did not handle?" Vernier swallowed. His hands shook. "I thought perhaps he wanted to learn, to better himself. People have ambitions." Maigret said nothing. He let the silence grow heavy, let Vernier fill it with his own discomfort. The man shifted from foot to foot, his eyes darting to the door as if escape might be allowed. Finally, Maigret nodded once, pocketed the papers, and turned to leave. He had no intention yet of accusing Vernier. The man was too small, too frightened, too honest in his dishonesty. But the path led through him as surely as the Seine led under the bridge. Outside, the day was sinking toward evening. The air had thickened again, promising more rain. Maigret walked slowly back toward the prefecture, his hat low, pipe heavy in his hand. He had no evidence, not yet. Only the smell of wrongness, of ordinary men tangled in something larger than their courage. A dead man with polished shoes, a typist who came by night, a barman who rented drawers, a woman who fled down the stairs. It was not yet a case. It was a mood, a texture, a fabric he could feel but not yet name. And that, he knew, was when the truth was nearest. When it was still hidden under gestures, under silences, waiting for the moment when someone's nerve would falter and the whole thing collapse like damp paper. The sky pressed lower as Maigret reached the Quai des Orfèvres, the light thinning into an afternoon that already felt like dusk. The Seine rolled by sluggishly, carrying the smell of wet iron and mud. Inside, the familiar corridors of the police headquarters were noisy in their usual way, phones ringing, boots clattering, a clerk hurrying past with a bundle of reports under his arm. Maigret's presence quieted it only slightly. Men nodded but did not linger, sensing his mood. He went to his office and sat without removing his coat, pipe clenched but unlit, the papers from the dead man spread across the desk in a patient disorder that was more orderly than it appeared. He stared at the carbon copies in the notebook, not to read them again, but to let them speak in their silence. They had the air of something meant to convince, yet too contrived to be convincing. Someone had wanted these figures copied and corrected. But for whom? For accusation or defense? For leverage over Chevalier and Fils? Or to protect it? He tapped the stem of his pipe against the desk once, twice. These were not the ambitions of a lonely lodger-playing clerk. This was business that smelled faintly of desperation. A knock came, sharp and quick, and without waiting for an answer, Inspector Lognon entered. His raincoat was still buttoned, his hat dripping onto the floor. His face wore its usual expression of wounded gloom, as though the world had singled him out for minor injustices that never amounted to enough. "You're on this Charenton thing?" he asked, his tone both suspicious and resigned, as if he had known Maigret would be. "I'm looking," Maigret said simply. Lognon pulled out a chair and sat heavily, his elbows braced. "There's talk," he muttered. "Always talk. At Chevalier and Fil's they say someone's been sniffing around the books. Nothing official. But merchants gossip like old women, and there's a woman." He glanced sideways, savoring the word. "There's always a woman," Maigret said dryly. "This one works for them, in the office. Typist. Mademoiselle Albertine. Some say she was friendly with a certain lodger from Rue de Touraine." "Friendly," Maigret repeated, his tone flat, as though tasting the word before setting it aside. Lognon nodded, his lips pursed. "You know how it is. They say she was seen with him on Sundays, down by the river. People see things they remember afterward. At the time, it means nothing." Maigret leaned back in his chair. The typewritten pages, the late-night visitor with a machine at home, a woman's letters in a careful round hand, a figure that might fit each role, or two different figures crossing paths without meaning to. He drew in a slow breath and let it out again, watching the smoke that wasn't there yet. "You spoke to her?" he asked. Lognon looked indignant. "Me? Why me? I'm only repeating what I hear." Maigret rose, gathering the notebook and the key, slipping them into his pocket. He reached for his coat and hat again. "You'd better come, Lognon." The typist lived in a small flat on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Antoine. The concierge, a woman with thin hair and a shawl, opened the door and eyed them with suspicion. "Albertine, she's not here. She's at her work." "We'll wait," Maigret said. He had a way of saying such things that ended conversation. They waited in the dim lobby that smelled of cabbage water and damp wool. The concierge clattered in her kitchen. The stairwell echoed with the footfalls of tenants coming and going. At 6:30, Mademoiselle Albertine returned. She was young, no more than 24, with a pale oval face and tired eyes. Her hands were red from cold typewriter keys. She stopped short when she saw them, glanced at the concierge, then at the two inspectors. "Commissaire," she said softly, not as a question but as an acknowledgement. They climbed the stairs together to her flat. It was neat, the sort of neatness that comes of habit rather than pride. A small table with a checked cloth, a vase with 2 wilted flowers, a typewriter on the desk by the window. She removed her coat and folded it carefully, setting it on the chair. "You knew Monsieur Bernard," Maigret said, his voice as quiet as the room. Her lips parted, then closed. She lowered herself onto the chair opposite. "Yes," she said at last. "I knew him. He was no clerk." She flinched. "No. What was he?" Her hands, clasped in her lap, tightened until the knuckles showed white. "He said he wanted to help me. He asked about the books at the office. He said he had friends who needed to know certain things. He said it wasn't wrong, only protection. That was the word he used." She swallowed. "I gave him nothing, but he made copies. He showed them to me. He asked me to check them." "And you did?" She nodded, a quick, helpless movement. "Only small things. Totals. Dates. He said it was only practice for his own learning. I believed him at first. He was kind. He spoke as if he admired me. I was foolish." Maigret let the silence sit. She filled it after a moment, her words spilling. "Then I saw him with another man. A short one, with a lighter that clicked. They argued outside the office one evening. I didn't hear what they said, but I knew it was no practice. He was working for someone. He was afraid." "You wrote to him," Maigret said, not accusing. Her eyes widened. "How?" "You wrote in a round hand, careful." Color rose in her cheeks. "Only once or twice. Nothing important." He didn't answer. Lognon shifted impatiently, but Maigret raised a hand. "Last Thursday," he said softly. "What happened?" Her lips trembled. She pressed her hands together as if to keep them still. "He sent word. He wanted me to meet him near the bridge. I went. He was pale, coughing. He said it was finished, that he had taken what he needed from the drawer at the buvette. He said someone wanted it that night, but he was afraid to go back. He begged me to say nothing, to forget him. He pressed something into my hand, a key." She stopped, her eyes filling. "A small key," Maigret said. She nodded. "Yes, but then he snatched it back. He said no, he must keep it. He walked away and I never saw him again. The next morning I heard—" She broke off. Lognon made a small noise, halfway between a sigh and a grunt. Maigret rose, looking at the typewriter by the window. The ribbon was fresh, the keys clean. He stepped closer, bent, and saw a faint smudge of carbon paper in the wastebasket. She followed his gaze and whispered, "I didn't type for him." "I swear it. It was the other man, the one with the lighter. He came to fetch the papers, not me." Maigret turned, pipe in hand, and studied her pale face. She looked less like a conspirator than a frightened girl who had let herself be persuaded too easily. He believed her, but the story had deepened. The dead man had removed something from the drawer. He had been pressed by someone impatient. He had been afraid enough to cling to the key even as he spoke of surrender. Outside, the rain began again, soft against the window panes. Maigret slipped his hat back on. "You'll stay here," he told her. "Don't leave. If anyone comes asking for you, say nothing. Someone will be watching." Her lips trembled. She whispered, "Do you know who killed him?" He looked at her a long moment. "Not yet," he said, "but we're nearer." In the corridor, Lognon tugged at his coat collar and muttered, "She's holding back." "They always are," Maigret said, his tone almost weary. "What matters is what she couldn't hide." They descended the stairs in silence. Outside, the lamps had come on, glowing in the mist, their halos blurred by the rain. Maigret pulled his collar higher and walked slowly, pipe heavy in his pocket. The matchbox, with its faded blue advertisement, seemed to burn against his side. The key was gone from the drawer before Friday. What had been in it had changed hands, perhaps twice, before the man in the boarding house lay cold with polished shoes and a cough that would trouble him no more. The Seine was swollen still, whispering under the bridges. He knew that soon someone else would come undone, not from evidence, but from silence, from waiting, from the unbearable weight of ordinary guilt. And when that moment came, he would be there, patient, immovable, as he had always been. The rain had deepened into a steady curtain by the time Maigret and Lognon crossed back toward the river. The streets glistened under the lamps, reflections trembling in every puddle. A tram screeched as it rounded the corner, sparks bright against the wet dark. Maigret walked slowly, as if the pace itself might draw out the strands of the case that refused to show themselves. Lognon shuffled beside him, his gloom intact, his collar turned high. "She's hiding something," Lognon muttered again, the refrain he clung to when uncertain. "They all are," Maigret said, his voice low. "It doesn't matter. What matters is the fear." "Fear of whom?" "That," Maigret replied, puffing at his pipe, though it had long gone out. "We shall see." They stopped at a corner cafe, one of those places that stayed open later than it ought, a haven for clerks too tired to go home and for men who liked the anonymity of smoke-filled back rooms. Inside it was warm, the windows steamed, the air thick with coffee and vin ordinaire. Maigret ordered beer, Lognon a cognac, and they sat near the back where the tables were scarred with initials cut by men long gone. Maigret said little. He let the beer sit before him, his eyes half-lidded as if dozing, but his mind moved steadily. Bernard, the lodger with 2 names and polished shoes. Morel, the typist with the quick hands and quicker denials. Albertine, the young woman with the careful script and frightened eyes. Vernier, the bookkeeper who noticed sounds through walls but claimed to notice nothing else. A drawer at a buvette in Charenton. A matchbox with its weight wrong. A brass key that no longer opened what it once had. He thought of the briefcase missing from the room. He thought of Bernard's cough and of the glass ring of moisture on the table that had not matched the full jug. Someone had been there after him, someone impatient, perhaps desperate. Lognon shifted restlessly. It's embezzlement, isn't it? Fraud. They've all dipped their fingers in. This Bernard thought to sell copies. He found a buyer, and they silenced him. Perhaps, Maigret said, and drank. But his tone was not agreement. It was only acknowledgement that the idea existed. He had seen fraud before, men undone by figures in ledgers. It was always sordid, but it was rarely fatal unless fear outweighed sense. What he smelled here was fear. Thick, clinging, heavier than the rain. When they left the café, the night had thinned. The rain slackened, though the pavement still glittered. They walked back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, and in the glow of the lamps on the Pont Marie, Maigret stopped. His large figure was motionless, his gaze on the black water sliding past below. "You'll go home, Lognon," he said quietly. Lognon looked startled. "And you?" "I'll wait. The house in Rue de Turenne. Someone will return. They always do. Something is left behind, or something must be taken back." Lognon sighed as if burdened, then shrugged. "You'll do as you do." He left, his steps quickening, eager for the warmth of his own bed. Maigret turned and retraced his way to the boarding house. The streets were nearly empty now. At the door, Madame Besson started when she saw him again. Her eyes were ringed from lack of sleep, her apron twisted in her hands. Still it isn't finished." "Not yet," Maigret said. He brushed past her gently and mounted the stairs. The dead man's room had been cleared now, the body removed, but the smell of him lingered. Smoke and damp cloth and the faint sharpness of medicine. The table still bore the faint mark of the glass. The shoes still sat neatly aligned, untouched. He sat in the chair by the window. The lamp was low, the flame hissing faintly. He filled his pipe but did not light it. He waited. The house was not silent. A murmur of voices from a room above, the sound of someone coughing, the creak of floorboards as tenants settled. He had waited in such rooms 100 times before. Patience was the net he cast, and sooner or later someone always swam into it. It was nearly midnight when he heard the step. Not the weary tread of the workman upstairs, nor the careful tiptoe of Rose. This was slower, deliberate, a man who tried not to be heard, but could not silence his weight. It paused on the landing, then moved toward the door. The handle turned, the door opened a fraction, then wider. A shadow entered, then froze at the sight of Maigret sitting by the window, pipe in hand. It was Vernier, the bookkeeper. His spectacles glinted in the lamplight, his face pale and drawn. He stood in the doorway, mouth working as if to shape words, but none came. "You've come back," Maigret said gently. Vernier swallowed. I thought perhaps," he faltered. "You thought perhaps you left something." He nodded, a small jerky movement. His eyes fell to the table, to the place where the matchbox had been, and then to the chair where the collar had rested. His throat moved again. "What did you leave, Vernier?" Nothing. Only," he twisted his hands, "I wanted to see if anyone knew," Maigret finished for him. He let the words sit. "You worked in the same office as Bernard. You knew the figures he copied." Vernier shook his head too quickly. "I didn't, I swear. I saw him, yes. He asked questions, but I never—" "You heard his lighter," Maigret said, his tone quiet, almost musing. "But it was not his lighter. It was Morel's. You knew the difference. You knew too much. Vernet's hands trembled. He gripped the door frame as if it might hold him upright. He wanted money, he whispered at last. He said he would show the papers, that the accounts were false. I begged him. He wouldn't listen. He said it was his chance. His voice cracked. I didn't kill him, I swear. I only begged him. Begged him, Maigret repeated, watching the man shrink into himself. And when he was found dead, you came back here to see if his room held what he threatened you with. Vernet's eyes shone with sweat or tears. Yes, he whispered. I thought if the papers were here, they would ruin me. My children, my wife. Maigret rose slowly, his broad figure filling the room. Vernier stepped back. Maigret put a hand on his shoulder. Steady, not harsh. You didn't kill him? But someone did, someone who wanted what he carried. Perhaps the same who pressed him for the draw. Perhaps Morel, perhaps another. But you. You'll tell me about the false accounts. You'll tell me everything. Vernier sagged under the weight of the hand, his nod quick and broken. Yes, he said. Yes. Together they left the room. On the landing, the lamp sputtered, its halo of light trembling. Downstairs, the house was quiet except for the faint snore of the concierge. Outside, the rain had thinned to a mist, wrapping the street in a damp silence. Maigret walked beside the bookkeeper, pipe unlit in his hand, his mind turning over the pieces with patient gravity. A dead man with polished shoes and a cough. A typist who feared her own letters. A drawer in Charenton, emptied before it could speak. A key that no longer fit. And now, Vernier, broken by fear, whispering of false accounts. The truth was close. He could feel it, like the smell of rain before it fell. It would come not in a shout, but in a collapse. Quiet, inevitable, the way a rotten beam gives way under its own weight. He had only to wait a little longer, listening to the silence, letting it betray the one who could no longer bear it. The Seine was swollen and dark when Maigret led Vernier across the Pont Marie toward the Préfecture. The bookkeeper walked as though each step carried him further into quicksand, his shoulders hunched, his thin frame trembling in the damp air. He muttered half-sentences, fragments of excuses, words that dissolved before they found meaning. Maigret said nothing. His silence was not cruel but heavy, the kind of silence that pressed down until men found themselves confessing simply to lighten their own breathing. In the office, the lamplight gave the walls a faint yellow glow. Maigret hung his coat on the peg, filled his pipe, and only then gestured for Vernier to sit. The man perched on the chair like a schoolboy before a master, his fingers picking nervously at the seam of his hat. The night beyond the window was blurred by rain, the river invisible, though its smell seemed to linger even here. You'll tell me, Maigret said at last, his voice calm, almost weary. Not in a rush, slowly. You'll tell me what Bernard had that frightened you enough to come back to his room at midnight. Vernier nodded quickly, too quickly. It isn't what it seems. I never stole. I adjusted. Small things. My employer, Monsieur Chevalier, he trusted me. But there were gaps, you understand. Gaps from shipments, from the bargemen. The accounts never balance perfectly. He prefers them to look correct, so He spread his trembling hands helplessly. I balanced them. You falsified them, Maigret said without emphasis. Yes, only to make them neat. No one lost, no one gained. Only numbers moved. But Bernard, he saw. He came into the office one evening when I had left a page open. He was curious, always curious. He began to ask questions, then he asked for papers. At first I laughed, but he was insistent. He said he had friends who paid for such things. He said I should not worry, that no one would know. I was a fool. I let him copy. I thought perhaps he would be satisfied. And he wasn't, Maigret murmured. Number. He wanted more, always more. He asked me for names, for accounts of wine sent to the colonies, for figures I had smoothed. I told him no. He grew angry. He said he had enough already, enough to ruin me. He wanted money. Vernier's voice broke. I have children, commissaire. A wife. I couldn't let it. You paid him. No. His eyes darted up, desperate. I didn't have it. I begged him. I told him to burn the papers. He only laughed. He said they were safe. In a drawer. In Charenton. The key in Maigret's pocket pressed against him as if in confirmation. He leaned back, letting smoke curl from his pipe. And Friday? What happened? I don't know. Vernier's voice dropped. He didn't come to the office. Then I heard the next morning that he was dead. My God, commissaire, I thought perhaps someone else, someone he tried to sell to. Perhaps they killed him. I went to his room because I thought, if the papers were there. He buried his face in his hands. I swear to you, I never touched him. I never harmed him. Maigret watched the man's shoulders shake. He believed him. Not because Vernier was incapable of murder. Fear could drive any man, but because the trembling was too raw, too small for the weight of blood. Vernier's crime was cowardice, not violence. Someone else had crossed the line Bernard had drawn. When the bookkeeper had been sent away under guard, Maigret remained at his desk, staring at the smoke that rose and dissolved into the lamplight. Bernard had pressed too hard. He had played with numbers he did not understand, with people whose patience was short. The typist, Albertine, had been frightened into silence. Vernier had been frightened into desperation, and Bernard himself had been frightened into hiding things in matchboxes and drawers. But fear alone did not stop a heart. Someone had been there in that narrow room, someone who had pressed the silence too far. The next morning was raw and grey. Maigret walked again to Rue de Turenne. The house seemed more tired than before, its shutters streaked by rain, the smell of cabbage stronger. Madame Besson met him with wary eyes, as if she had begun to regret ever calling the police. He climbed the stairs and stood once more in the empty room. Without the body, it had the air of a stage after a play, props left behind, meaning gone. Yet the details remained. The neat shoes, the damp glass ring, the ashtray with its mixed butts. He stood at the window, looking down into the street. The cobbles shone. A boy ran by, splashing water. A woman with a basket pulled her shawl tighter, ordinary life, untouched by the death above it. He turned, his gaze falling on the matchbox once more, now returned to the table. He opened it, slid out a match, lit his pipe, and drew in smoke. The small act seemed to bind the room back to him, to claim it. He thought of Morel, the typist with the quick hands and the nervous lighter. Morel had been the courier, the copyist, the one who carried letters and parcels. Bernard had leaned on him as much as on Vernier, and Morel had come late at night, clutching papers, smelling of foreign tobacco. Perhaps not only a messenger, but something more. A man who knew where to place papers, who to sell them to, and when a man had become too dangerous to keep alive. By afternoon, Maigret was in Charenton again. The buvette was busier, men crowded at the counter, voices raised over the clatter of glasses. He took his place at the same table, ordered a glass, and waited. He had learned long ago that patience in such places was more useful than a warrant. It was almost evening when the door opened and Morel entered. He looked thinner in the daylight, his coat damp, his eyes darting. He froze for a second when he saw Maigret, then forced himself to move to the counter to order a glass with too much casualness. Maigret did not move. He only puffed his pipe, watching smoke blur the edges of the room. After a while, Morel came over, carrying his glass. He tried to smile, but his lips trembled. "Commissaire, I didn't expect—" "No," Maigret said mildly. "You didn't." They sat in silence. The bargeman at the next table laughed loudly, masking the hush between them. Morel's hands shook as he lifted the glass. His lighter glinted when he set it on the table, the same neat click as before. "You brought him papers," Maigret said. "You posted letters. You typed copies." "I only did what he asked," Morel whispered. "I was paid. That is all." "You were paid by whom?" Morel's throat worked. He looked at the door, then at the key that Maigret placed quietly on the table between them. His face drained. "He kept it," Morel murmured. "He should have given it to me. He said he would, but he kept it. He thought he could bargain. I told him it was dangerous. I told him—" His words broke. His hand gripped the glass so tightly it trembled. "And Friday night." Maigret's voice was soft, almost kind. Morel shut his eyes. His lips moved soundlessly. Then he whispered, "I only went to fetch the papers." He was coughing, sitting on the bed. He said he wouldn't give them. He laughed at me. He said he would ruin us all. I only wanted to frighten him. I swear, only frighten. His eyes opened, wide and wild. He choked. He fell. I didn't touch him. God help me, I didn't touch him. He died while I stood there. Maigret drew on his pipe, his face unreadable. He had heard such words before, men insisting they hadn't meant it, that death had come of its own accord. Sometimes it was true. Sometimes it was the last refuge of guilt. "You left the briefcase," he said. Morel nodded, shuddering. "I took only the papers I had written. Nothing else. I left him there. I swear I left him breathing. When I heard the next day—" His voice broke. "I thought it was me. I thought I had killed him with fear." The bargemen shouted again, their laughter echoing. Maigret sat back, pipe in hand, watching Morel's trembling. He did not press further. Not yet. He would wait, as he always did, until silence did the work for him. The truth, he knew, would surface. Not with a revelation, but with a collapse, a breaking under the weight of ordinary human guilt. And in that moment, Morel would give himself away, as surely as Bernard had with his polished shoes and his careful lies. Outside, the river slid on, indifferent. The rain began again, soft, insistent, carrying the smell of the city into the night. The bargemen's laughter thinned into a murmur, then into the low clink of glasses, and in that hush, Morel's breath rasped against the smoke between them like a file. He had said what he could say without losing himself altogether. Maigret did not press. He watched the thin man's fingers tighten around the glass until a film of wine crept up the inside with his tremor, then slide back. At last Morel stood, slipping the lighter into his pocket as if it were the only object in the world that could keep him from drifting apart, and went out into the rain with the stooped determination of a man who knows he has not escaped, but has, for a few hours, not been caught. Maigret waited after him, letting the buvette resume its ordinary rhythm. Men returned to their muttering. A woman at the far table coughed dryly and pressed a scarf to her chest. The barman avoided looking toward the wall where the drawers lay hidden behind a plank. When Maigret rose, he touched the brim of his hat as if a man were leaving politely, not the police. Outside, Charenton smelt of vinegary wine and wet rope. The rain had softened to a steady mist that flattened sounds, and the river slid by like a thought a man could not quite hold. He followed Morel at a distance for a few streets, long enough to watch him turn twice without reason and tell himself there was no one behind him. The slope of the man's shoulders was enough. There was no bravado in it, only the small, stubborn refusal to look at his own fear. By the time Maigret reached the Quai des Orfèvres, the lamps had smeared yellow on the damp panes and the corridors gave back the thin echoes of men going home. He sat in his chair without taking off his coat. He did not relight his pipe. The papers from the dead man lay under his palm with the patient weight of things that meant more than they said. He shifted them aside and took out the notebook again. B.S. Dim. The small letters sat in the margin like a reminder a man makes for himself because he is afraid he will bolt at the last minute. Beneath the scrap with Rose, Rue Amelos, folded once, twice, then carefully slipped back. On the key's neck, the faint blue smudge of thread he had noticed in the dim light the night before was visible again, a small stain a laundress would have licked her finger to rub away. He went home very late. The apartment was warm, the stove's heat gathered in the corners like a cat. Madame Maigret looked up from her mending and did not ask questions. He took the bowl she set before him, soup that had given up its steam to the room hours ago, and ate it as if hunger were something one could do out of habit. He put the matchbox from Simenon on the table without thinking. It lay there like an object from another life. "You always empty them into the jar," she said, nodding at it, her needle held arrestingly in the air. "Otherwise the damp gets in the sand and they stick." He glanced down. "This one is special." "They're all special when men are afraid they'll run out," she said, and threaded the cotton through the eye in a practiced movement. "When my father had his cough, he left rings on the table from the glass because he never drank far enough down to tip the jug. He said the first mouthful cured the thirst, and the rest tasted of the medicine." She went back to her hem, measuring without looking. "When you're afraid, you take sips. You don't swallow." He grunted, not because he disagreed, but because in that room, with that voice, the small fact took its place among the others with a satisfaction that was almost physical. The ring on the dead man's table had had a clean, sharp edge. A man who drinks to quench his thirst leaves no ring. He drains the glass and fills it again. A man who tastes medicine in fear leaves the circle like a coin on a counter and pushes the jug away. He slept a few hours in the heavy, dreamless way of a man who has learned to step off a moving train and step on again where he needs to. In the morning, the sky was a shade lighter than wet slate. At the office, Lognon appeared in the doorway as if he had been there all night, damp and indignant. He announced nothing, only stood as though the weight of the day would be the same as yesterday and would fit him just as badly. It was not Lognon who changed the air in the room. It was the knock that barely touched the wood, and then the young woman who came in with her hair darkened by the mist, emplastered in strands against her temples. Albertine kept her hands together in front of her as if to prove she was not hiding anything in them. She did not look at Lognon. She looked at the big man behind the desk with eyes that had not closed much and spoke before she sat down. "I took the briefcase," she said. The sentence sagged in the room after it had been said, the way a line sags when the fish stops fighting. She stood with her back against the closed door as if afraid the corridor would pull her away again. "When?" Maigret asked after a moment. "Monday night," she whispered. "Late." He had said, "On Thursday." If he did not come to me by Sunday, I was to go. He had the key then, and I thought he would give it to me. He took it back. On Monday I waited, and I told myself not to go, and at last I could not go. I climbed the stairs. Madame did not hear me, and I opened the door. He was sleeping. I think he was sleeping. I didn't go near. I took the briefcase from under the chair and closed the door. I was afraid he would wake and see me. "You didn't speak to him," Maigret said. Her eyes filled. "I'm not brave." She said it without drama, as if stating an address. "I came home and put the case in the cupboard, and I sat on the bed with my coat on until the morning. When I heard—" She swallowed, and the movement made the wet strands of hair shift against her cheek. "I should have come at once. I thought they would say I had taken more than a case." "Where is it now?" She set it on the chair where she had folded her coat the night before last. It had the look of a respectable object that had never been asked to carry anything more dangerous than a sandwich and a book. The leather was rubbed thin at the corners. The lock gave under Maigret's thumb the way locks give when they understand there is no point. Inside were the things that make up a man who has tried to take up less space than his own body. a spare collar wrapped in paper, a pencil with teeth marks near the point, a handkerchief washed too many times, a folded newspaper clipping about ships leaving Le Havre, 3 onion skin pages with figures corrected in a careful, not quite clerkly hand, and a bottle with a cloudy line a finger's breadth from the bottom, its label promising relief for catarrh and cough, its cap sticky. When he lifted it, the faint ghost of menthol and something bitter rose and was gone. Albertine watched his hands. "He drank from the glass," she said. "He always did that after the medicine. He told me the water took away the taste." She blinked, as if in surprise at remembering something from an ordinary conversation that had become important now the man who had spoken it no longer could. Lognon made a noise that could have been satisfaction or impatience. "So, he drowned himself in syrup," he muttered, and then looked as if he regretted the phrase. He was not unkind. Clumsiness often went ahead of him and knocked into furniture he hadn't seen. Maigret turned the bottle in his hand. The sticky ring around the cap had caught a thread. A tiny fiber dyed blue. It stuck to the glass, curled like a hair. He rubbed it between finger and thumb and left it on the desk. The same blue as the smudge on the key. He put the bottle down, says he very gently, as if it were the last fragile thing a man had owned. "You went to Charenton on Sunday," he said, not a question. Albertine colored as if he had named her in a public place. "I wanted to see if he would come." He said Sunday, like a promise. I sat for a long time with one glass. The barman looked at me as though I had stolen his seat. A little later I saw. She stopped. "It doesn't matter." "It matters," Maigret said mildly. "I saw him with the small man," she said. "The one who types." They were at the door. He laughed at something and then he looked at me as if I ought not to be there, and I went out. I walked by the river and my shoes let in water. It rained so hard the scarf stuck to my mouth. She smiled without any humor. It seemed to me that if a man could laugh at a door, he could laugh at anything. Lognon shifted. "So you followed him, perhaps?" "To the room. You had the key. You argue. He dies." Albertine's head came up with that stubborn little movement women make when they decide not to cry in front of men. "I did not kill anyone, monsieur," she said quietly. "I have barely killed a hen." "Who else knew you had the case?" Maigret asked. "No one." She hesitated. "Rose knew, a little, not about the case, about—" She looked at her hands as if the shape of them could tell her what she had done. "He was kind to me. He was kind in a way that is dangerous to a girl who has no one." Maigret nodded as if she had told him the time. He did not open the onion skin pages. He did not need to. They would say what they had said the day before, that men had shifted numbers until numbers had learned to shift themselves and sleep nicely in ledgers. He put the case aside and poured her a little water in his own glass. She did not drink it. "You'll go home," he said. "You'll leave the door on the latch for the woman who brings coal. If anyone asks questions, you will say you are tired and want to sleep. Someone will sit at the corner." He looked at Lognon. "You will not frighten her neighbors." Lognon accepted this as a personal affront to his nature. "Am I a clown that I go about frightening neighbors?" he demanded, and then muttered something about men who thought they were the only ones who knew how to wait. He went out with his hat already at the wrong angle. When she was gone, careful of the briefcase as though it might be a live thing, Maigret sat a long time without touching his pipe. The little blue fiber lay by the bottle cap. He thought of the thread knot on the key, the shade a seamstress might use because it was what she had in the needle and it would do unless the dress was black. He thought of the dead man's polished shoes and the way the bare toes had curled as if against a draught. He thought of Sunday written small in a notebook and of a buvette where drawers held the courage men had not found in themselves. In the afternoon he went to Rue Amelot. The sisters' flat smelt of steam and hot iron. The hiss of a flat iron going back and forth covered the sound of the city. Mademoiselle Rose looked younger in the heat, her hair damp, a pin held between her lips. She took it out when she saw him. "I saw your name on the scrap," he said, and she did not pretend not to know what scrap. She sat on the edge of a chair, hands on her knees, as if she had been called to recite. He showed her the key and the blue mark. "I tied it," she said, almost with pride, and then colored. "He asked for a strong thread because the hole was small. I gave him the blue. He said he would keep the key where no one would think to look." She glanced up quickly, guilty of a cleverness that might have been a betrayal. "He was not very clever, monsieur. He wanted to be. He asked you for anything else?" She hesitated. "To sew a little pocket in the lining of his coat. Only big enough for a paper. Nothing heavy. I did it quickly, and he paid me more than it was worth." She bit her lip. "Another woman came once to ask if I knew where he had gone. She was in a hurry, and spoke as if her voice would break if it did not get where it was going. I told her nothing. It is not my business." "Scarf?" he asked. "Yes." She held it in her hand as if it were a handkerchief. Her eyes were... She stopped. "It is not my business," she repeated softly now, as if wishing it were. On the way back, the sky had torn open briefly and given the streets a lighter color before thinking better of it. The doctor met him on the stair at the prefecture, his bag bumping his knee. He lifted his eyebrows and answered the unasked question with professional impatience. "With that heart and that cough," he said, "with that syrup and fear." He shrugged. "You have seen men die sitting up with a pipe in their hand." "I see them. It is not dramatic. It is how men die when their courage is not the part that fails." Could he have been frightened into it? The doctor made a face. "Fright does not stop the blood by itself. But fright gives a man the excuse to take one more spoon than he should and to forget that his lungs are stupid. And if a man talks while he should breathe..." He snapped his bag. "You know all this. You only want to hear it from a man who wears a stethoscope." Maigret nodded. He did know. He had known since the ring on the table and the sweet bitter ghost in the air. But men preferred their guilt to be exact, and he would give it to them in the measure they could swallow. When evening came, he did what he had done before. He went to sit in the kitchen at Rue de Turenne, where the stove's heat made a small island in the draught. Madame Besson put a cup in front of him without looking at him. Her mouth tightened with the effort of minding her own house. The tenants came and went like actors returning to a stage where the play had been cancelled. Somewhere above, the workman sang one line of a song and then stopped, as if he had reached the word he did not want to say. At a little before 10, the door opened and Morel stood on the threshold in a way that said he had not decided whether to enter or to walk into the river with his lighter in his pocket. He came in. He sat without being invited. He put the lighter on the table between them as if laying down a knife. "I didn't kill him," he said, in a voice that had worn itself thin on the words. "But I was the last to make him choose." He looked at his hands. He looked at the cup of coffee he did not touch. He made a small sound that was neither a sob nor a laugh. "When I left," he whispered, "he was alive." He had that way of looking at the ceiling a man has when he is thinking of telling a lie to himself. "I took my papers. He said there would be no more. I believed him and I didn't. I had had enough of believing men who wanted to be something else." Maigret did not ask a question. He waited. The other man's shoulders dropped in that small way that signals surrender, not to another man, but to the truth a man has been walking around for days because he cannot bring himself to step into it. "He was a decent fool," Morel said at last. "I am not even that. If you must arrest me, do it now. I have a wife who will pretend not to know why." He folded his hands on the table as if to show he would not run. "We will see," Maigret said. His voice held neither promise nor threat. He reached for his pipe, not because he needed it, but because the movement told the room that the waiting had not ended, only shifted. Outside, the rain began again with a practiced hand, tapping the window as if to remind them that Paris would keep breathing whether men told the truth or not. He sat and smoked, and somewhere between the first and the second match, the last thread of the story tightened silently toward the knot it had been making all along. Morel did not leave when he had finished, saying he was ready to be arrested. He sat a moment longer, as men do when they have delivered themselves into someone else's hands and are waiting to feel those hands close. The stove clicked and settled. Madame Besson had gone to her room, leaving the cup where it was, the line of coffee clinging brown halfway up as if it, too, had decided not to go further. "Who sent you to fetch papers?" Maigret asked at last, his voice as flat as the table. "No one," Morel said quickly, the reflex of a man who has told that lie all his life about small things. He let the silence press him a little, then added in a tone that tried to sound brave, "Men who have papers send for a typist. I am a typist. And men who are afraid of papers, they also send," he whispered, and his eyes dropped to the lighter. "From the office. Not the bookkeeper, the other, the one in the waistcoat who watches the door as if it were a window." He said only, "Whatever he has, bring it to me. He is making trouble for good people." "Good people," he repeated, and the words were small in his mouth. Maigret did not ask the name. He knew the kind of man, a careful clerk whose collar was always straight, who did not mind that the figures slept a little easier if they lay in different beds at the end of the day. He stood, and Morel stood also, as if pulled on a string. "You'll go home," Maigret said. "If you leave Paris, you will be found in Lyon, in Marseille, on the quay at Le Havre. If you stay, you will be called tomorrow. Do you understand?" Morel looked incredulous, and then something like grief crossed his face. "Yes," he said, and picked up the lighter as one takes back a small dignity. At the door he turned. "He was not brave," he said. "Neither am I." Then he went into the wet hallway, and the house swallowed him. When the door had finished vibrating itself into stillness, Maigret sat again. He did not light his pipe. He stayed until the lamp above the landing burned a ring of soot on the ceiling. Then he rose, went to the dead man's room, and took from the peg the coat that had hung there all along, heavy with damp and with the smell of a man who has always been poor. He folded it over his arm and left the house without explanation. Madame Besson heard the door and turned in her bed, telling herself she had not heard it. At the Quai des Orfèvres, he set the coat on his desk and sat with it, looking not at the cloth, but at what the cloth suggested. The little pocket a quick hand had sewn into the lining because a man had asked for something just big enough for a paper. He found the stitches with his thumb, and then with his nail. They were small and neat, a woman's. He could almost see Rose's head bent to them, her lip caught between teeth that were too even for her to have been starving as long as she said she had. He teased the seam open and drew out what lay within, a folded strip of cheap paper worn to softness along its edges. He opened it and saw a hand that was neither clerk's nor labourer's. Dim. B.S. 5 heures. Si je manque, gardez. Sunday. Buvette des Sports. 5 o'clock. If I fail, keep. No name. There never is. He refolded it and slid it back into the pocket, and his fingers came away sticky. He lifted them to his nose without thinking and smelled again the little sweetness that had hovered in the room like a politeness a dead man offers to excuse his cough. On the cap of the bottle in the briefcase, a blue fibre had turned into a question mark against the glass. On the key's neck, a blue smudge had said the same thing. Threads are patient. They tell on the hands that touch them. The bottle, the key, the pocket, none of them had been moved by anyone who meant harm, only by a man arranging his fear as neatly as he arranged his shoes. In the morning, he sent for Vernier. The bookkeeper arrived with a face that had not slept in the air of someone who mistook the corridor outside Maigret's office for the steps up to a gallows. He stood with his hat in both hands. "I won't ask you for names," Maigret said. "You will tell them to the examining judge. I will ask you for something else. When men in your office were afraid, to whom did they speak?" Vernier's mouth opened and closed. He seemed surprised by the gentleness of the question, and the gentleness made him more afraid. "To Monsieur Chevalier's man," he whispered. "The cashier. He is the one who balances when I cannot. He is the one who says the word that makes the number go away." "And did you speak to him about the lodger?" "I begged him," Vernier said, and the word woke the same weariness in his shoulders it had woken the night before. "He told me to keep calm. He said he would see to it. He advised me to go home and not to be seen." He looked up suddenly, a miserable hope in him. If the figures had not. If the wine had come when it should. He stopped, because a man cannot tell a policeman that a river would be different if it ran uphill. When Vernier had gone under guard to write what he knew for the clerk with the official pen, Maigret took his hat and went to Chevalier and Fils. In daylight, the gold letters looked faded and the green paint more candid. The cashier was the man Morel had described without naming. A neat waistcoat, an expression that wore fairness the way a shop wears dust, everywhere and inoffensive. He smiled when Maigret gave his name and led him into a small room smelling of glue and paper. "A sad business," he said, before Maigret had spoken. "We heard. One tries to help the poor when one can. A lodger, was he? They have such fragile health in those houses. Damp walls. A cough can do the work of a knife, they say." "You sent a man to fetch papers," Maigret said. The cashier spread his hands. "We send men every day. Warehouse, customs. Papers fly about like pigeons. One must keep one's own pigeons clean. A bookkeeper brings his tooth to the account. It bites where it hurts him least. Then comes the lodger who likes to sit with a glass and be clever. There are always such men. He was not one of ours." "He made copies," Maigret said, laying one onion skin sheet on the desk as one puts down a photograph of a woman the other man has seen already. "He showed them to your typist." The cashier tilted his head as if listening to music whose tone bored him. "A girl is easily frightened. She will say anything after a policeman visits her in the night. We will not speak of the girl." "We will speak of the man who types," Maigret answered, and the faint smile moved on the cashier's face the way a crease moves in cloth when a hand smooths it. "He took what you wanted from a drawer and went to the lodger on Friday. He says the man died while he was there." The cashier's eyes stayed polite. "Men die," he said. "And in Paris they die near a glass. It is the city's way of being kind. We are merchants, monsieur. We sell wine. We do not prescribe it." "You will come tomorrow," Maigret said, standing. "If you have anything to bring, figures that have slept too well, you will bring them. If you do not, others will bring them for you. It will be worse." He put on his hat. "I will not touch your ledgers today. Let them sleep one more night." In the corridor, a clerk looked up at them and then quickly down again to his book. The cashier remained standing in his little room, hands still spread, as if the gesture had held him open, and he did not know how to close. At midday, Maigret walked back along the river. The sky had taken on a tired white, the color of paper that has been erased too often. He smoked without tasting it. He did not think of the cashier or of Vernier or of Morel as separate men. He thought of them as the water thinks of the different bits of refuse it carries, each with its own weight, all going the same way. At the apartment, Madame Maigret set his plate down and, after a moment, a small glass. "You never drink at midday," he said, mildly surprised. "You look like a man who is cold in a room that is too warm," she said. "It is only a little." He lifted it and put it back without tasting. "When you cough," he said, "do you drink first and then the medicine, or the other way?" "The other way," she said at once, and then, seeing his look, added, "A woman learns to make comfort follow the thing she does not like. Otherwise, she will not do it tomorrow." She made a small movement toward his pipe. "If you go to sit at the window, do not bring the pipe. It upsets the begonias." He smiled then, the slow, private smile that sat on his face like a shadow the sun cannot quite erase. In the afternoon he went not to the Prefecture, but back to Rue de Touraine. In the kitchen, the same heat lay over the same cracked saucer. Rose, who had come down to ask for coal, froze when she saw him, and then came the rest of the way, with the purposeful step of a girl who will not trip over her own fear. "You tied the thread," he said. "Blue?" "Yes." "You sewed the pocket?" "Yes." She lifted her chin. "I'm not ashamed." He asked, and he paid. "You told a woman he was kind," he said. "You told her nothing else." Her eyes went to the floor and back. "She had that face," she murmured. "That face women have when they are about to let a man put something heavy in their hands and tell them it is a gift." He nodded. "You have sewn a great deal." "Enough," she said, and the word was a pin that fastened the hem of her dignity. She turned and went upstairs, where the hiss of her sister's iron could be heard in the mind, even if it was not there in the house. By evening the inspector had gathered what he needed. Not proofs that shine like metal, but those small, stubborn facts that make their own. Weight, blue thread on a cap and on a key, a line in a notebook, a ring on a table, a bottle that was stickier at the rim than a careful man would allow if he were not trembling, a typist's lighter where matches should have been. He sent a man for Morel and another for the cashier. He did not send for Albertine. She had brought what she could and had nothing left that would not hurt her more to give. They came as men do when they have had time to think about not coming and have chosen instead to be done with it. The cashier wore the same waistcoat. The flower in his buttonhole was new. Morel's coat was still damp, as if it had not been dry once in a week. They sat in the small room off the corridor where the walls looked tired of other men's truths. "You went on Friday," Maigret said to Morel. "You saw a man who coughed in a table with a glass and a bottle. You told him to give you what he had. You were paid to say it." Morel's hands lay quiet now. The quietness was worse than the trembling. "Yes," he said, "I was paid." "You frightened him," Maigret continued. "He drank the syrup and he sipped the water and he lay back and told himself a lie he did not believe about tomorrow. You stood and watched, and then you took what you had written, and you left him." Morel nodded once. "You," Maigret said to the cashier, without turning his body, "sent the typist to fetch, and you told yourself you were protecting your employer from scandal. You will bring your books as they are and as you wish them to be." The cashier's smile had gone brittle. "I will bring what the law asks," he said, "and I will bring a lawyer." "Bring both," Maigret said. "One for the numbers, one for the conscience." He did not raise his voice. He did not strike the table. He sent them away with the same simple nod with which he had sent them in, and when the door closed, the room seemed to fill again with rain that was not there. It was late when he went out. The city had folded itself into corners. On the Pont Marie, he leaned his elbows on the cold stone and watched the river carry the lights of the quay in broken lines. He had not caught a murderer. He had caught what Paris makes every day, a handful of poor lies, a fear that sits in a chest like a tenant who pays late but pays 2 or 3 ordinary shames that men had thought they could keep in drawers. The dead man had wanted to be clever and to be kind. In the end, he had been neither, and it had been enough to stop his heart. He stood a long time, pipe unlit in his hand, the matchbox in his pocket light again now the key was gone. Somewhere behind him a woman's heels ticked on the stones and then were quiet. When he turned, the rain had begun once more, carefully, as if it had learned from other nights where to fall. He walked back without hurrying. There was coffee to be had somewhere, and silence to complete what words could not. The room had grown still after the last confession. It was as though the very walls of the house, which had heard so much whispered tension and the muffled sounds of furtive movements, were now listening to Maigret with bated breath. He sat heavily in his chair, his pipe smouldering, the faint tendrils of smoke curling up in the lamplight. His eyes, half closed yet sharply attentive, shifted from face to face, not with triumph, but with the quiet inevitability of a man who had known, long before the others, where the truth must finally lead. "You see," he said, his voice low, patient, carrying with it the weight of simple certainty. "There was never a mystery of shadows or accidents. Only the small lies each of you told to protect yourselves. Those lies became a net in which the murderer was caught." The accused sat stiffly, hands clasped so tightly their knuckles shone white. Maigret's gaze lingered, not in cruelty, but in that way of his which left no hiding place. He spoke gently, almost sadly, as though offering the other a final dignity. "You did not plan to kill that night. You went there to silence a threat, to recover something you believed would ruin you. But in the quarrel, in the panic, you struck. Afterwards, you tried to arrange everything so it would appear random, the work of a prowler, of fate itself. But fate rarely leaves muddy footprints in a hallway that only you had reason to walk." There was no shout of denial, no protest, just a trembling breath, shoulders sinking as if a great weight had finally been let fall. The others in the room, witnesses, family, neighbors, watched in silence. Some glanced away, ashamed of their own earlier suspicions. Others leaned forward as if to hear the final piece click into place. Maigret did not gloat. He never did. He drew once from his pipe and then set it aside, his large hands resting on his knees. "It was always about fear," he continued, more to the room than to the guilty party alone. "Fear of being exposed, fear of losing what you had built, and fear, mes amis, makes people do foolish, desperate things. But it also leaves traces, small ones, the inconsistencies in your words, the objects you moved but forgot to place exactly back, the one neighbor who heard your voice when you thought you whispered." He let that hang, and a murmur passed through the gathered group. The confession came quietly, almost inaudible. A nod, a broken line of words, more sob than speech. Maigret inclined his head, not as judge nor executioner, but as a man who had been expecting nothing less. The uniformed men waiting at the door stepped forward, but Maigret raised a hand to slow them. He knew there would be time enough for the handcuffs, for the report, for the trial. In this moment, he allowed silence to return, the silence in which truth had finally been spoken. When at last he rose, shrugging into his heavy coat, it was with the air of a man who had simply finished another long day's work. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft, steady, washing the pavements clean. He paused beneath the dripping eaves, struck a match, and lit his pipe anew. The others filtered out behind him, voices low, uncertain, the house no longer theirs to linger in. One by one they departed, leaving Maigret standing alone at the gate. The accused was led away without resistance, head bowed, the fight gone. For Maigret there was no triumph, no bitterness, only the quiet knowledge that life would go on, that in some small way order had been restored. He pulled his collar up against the damp chill and began to walk, his broad frame merging with the Paris night. Behind him, the house stood silent, its secrets spent, its windows dark once more. And so the case closed, not with a shout, but with the soft finality of rain against cobblestones, another crime understood, another human heart laid bare. Maigret's steps carried him away steadily, toward the faint glow of a cafe where warmth, a glass of beer, and the steady rhythm of ordinary life waited for him, as they always did, 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 as they always